Assalamu alaikum. Here's we know about psychology. What is psychology and how it plays an important role in our life? Psychology basically is the scientific study of human minds and behavior. Psychology is scientific disciplines that studies mental states and processes and behaviors in humans and other animals. The discipline of psychology is broadly divisible in two parts: a large profession of practitioners and a smaller but growing science of mind, brain, and social behavior. The two have distinct goals, trainings, and practice, but some psychologists integrate the two. It means that psychology tells us that it is the scientific study of mind and behavior, in which we study both minds and behavior. Early history, when psychology started, and it's known as scientific study. In Western culture, contribute to the development of psychology came from many areas, beginning with philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. Hippocrates, philosophers about basic human temper and their associated traits. Informed by the biology of his time, he speculated that physical qualities such as yellow bile or too much blood might underlie differences in temperament. See also humor. Aristotle postulated the brain to the seat of the rational human mind. It means that first of all, psychological history was studied in the era of Aristotle and Plato. History of psychology shows that how psychology started and how it's gradually increased. In the 17th century, Rene Descartes argued that the mind gives people the capacities of thoughts and consciousness. The mind decided and the body carries to the decisions. A dualistic mind body splits that modern psychological science is still working to overcome. He shows that psychology is basically the name of conscious, subconscious, and unconsciousness. Two figures who helped out the found psychology as a form disciplines and science in the 19th century were William Wundt in Germany and William James in the United States. These are the two founders of psychology who formed psychology as a discipline of science. James, the principle of psychology 1890s, defined psychology as a science of mental life and provided insightful decisions of topics and challenges that anticipated much of the field's research agenda a country later. In 1930s, John B. Watson, one of the influential founders of behaviorism, argued resilience on only objectively memorable actions and conditions, effectively removing the study of consciousness from psychology. Freud and his followers. Psychoanalytical theory and therapeutic practice developed by Vienna-trained physician Sigmund Freud and his many disciples, beginning early in the 20th century and enduring of many decades, were underlining the traditional view of human nature as essentially rational. Freud was the first Freud was a physician who was first discovered psychology as an analytical study. Freudian theory made reason secondary. The Freud and the unconscious and its often socially unacceptable irrational motives and desires. Particularly the sexual and aggressive were the dividing force underlying much of the human behaviors and mental illness. According to Freud's psychoanalytical theory, the id is the primitive and intellectual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories. The superego operates as a moral conscious, and the ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. It means Freud tell us three stages of personality. In these are called id, ego, and superego. Superego is the balancing stage, while id and ego are the realistic stage. In this graph, you can see easily how can ego, superego, and how is superego balanced ego and ego. Then we learn about schools of thoughts in psychology. These seven school of thoughts plays an important role in psychology. First of all, we study structuralism. Structuralism, the first school of psychology. Edward Big Tishner, one of the most famous student, would could go on to the found Edward Wintisher, one of the wanted most student who would go on to the FREUD found psychology first major school of thoughts. According to the structuralism, human consciousness could be broken down into the smaller parts using a process known as introspection. Trained subjects would attempt to break down their responses and reactions to the most basic sensation and perception. Second school of thought is functionalism of William James. Psychology first in America during the mid to late 1800th century. William James emerged as one of the major American psychologists during that period and published his classical textbook. The principle of psychology established him as the father of American psychology. His book soon became the standard text in psychology, and his ideas eventually served as the basis for a new school of thought known as functionalism. The focus on functionalism was about how behavior actually worked to help people live in their environment. Third school of psychology, the emergement of psychoanalysis, who is the founder is Freud. On this point, early psychologists stressed conscious human experience, and a strange physician named Sigmund Freud changed the force of psychology in a dramatic way, processing a theory of personality that emphasizes the importance of unconscious mind. Freud's clinical work with patients suffering from hysteria and other elements that led belief that the early childhood experience unconscious impulses contribute to the development of adult personality and behavior. The rise of behaviorism psychology changed dramatically during the 20th century, and another school of thought known as behaviorism rose to dominance. Behaviorism was a major change from previous theoretical practice, rejecting an emphasis on both of the conscious and unconscious mind. Instead, behaviorism sought to make psychology a more scientific discipline by focusing purely on observable behavior. Behaviorism had its earliest start with the work of Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov's research on the digestive system of dogs led to his discovery of the classical conditioning process, which proposed that the behavior can be learned via conditional association. The third force in psychology was while the first half of the 20th century was demonstrated by psychoanalysis and behaviorism, a new school of thought known as humanistic psychology emerged during the second half of the century, often referred to as the third force in psychology. This theoretical perspective and emphasis unconscious conscious experience. American psychologist Carl Rogers is often considered to be one of the founders of this school of thoughts. While psychoanalysts look at unconscious impulses and behaviorists focused on environmental causes, Rogers believes strongly in the power of the free will and self determinations. Cognitive psychology. During the 1950s and 1960s, a movement known as the cognitive revolution began to take hold in psychology. During this time, cognitive psychology began to replace psychoanalysis and behaviorism as the dominant approach to the study of psychology. Psychologists were still understand and looking at the observable behavior, but they were also concerned with what was going on inside in the mind. Since that time, cognitive psychology has remained as a dominant area of psychology. As research continued, to studies such as perception, memory, decision making, problem solving, and intelligence and language. The introduction of brain imaging tools such as MRI and PET scan also helped improve the ability of research to more closely study the inner working of the human brain. Women in psychology history. There are a number of women who made important contribution in the early history of psychology, although their work is sometimes overlooked. In which we discussed Mary Wheaton was rightfully earned a doctorate from Harvard, although the school refused to grant her degree because she was a woman. Despite troubles she faced, and she became the American Psychological Association first woman president. Then Anna Freud, who was the follower of Freud, who made important contribution in the field of psychoanalysis. She described many of the defense mechanisms and known as a founder of child psychoanalysis. She also had an influence on other psychoanalysts during Erik Erikson. Mary Annis, Mary Annisworth who was a developmental psychologist, made important contribution to our understanding of attachment. She developed a technique for studying child and caregiver attachment known as the strain situation assessment. This is a brief overview of psychological history. In order to understand how psychology became the science that is today, it is important to learn more about some of the historical events and that have influenced its development. While some of the theories that emerged during the earliest years of psychology may now be viewed as simplistic, outdated, or incorrect, these influences shape the direction of fields and help us form a great understanding of the human mind and behavior.